My grandson tugged on my sleeve during dinner and whispered, "Grandma, look under the table." I thought he was playing some childish game, but when I leaned down and saw what was hidden beneath that table, my heart stopped. Because in that moment, I realized the people sitting around me weren't just lying to me. They had been lying for years. Before I begin, if you've ever lived through betrayal like this, please like, leave a comment, and subscribe to channel. I always believed the most dangerous lies are the quiet ones that sit right at your dinner table, smiling at you while you pass the bread. The night everything changed started like any other Sunday in my daughter's house. The smell of roasted chicken filled the kitchen. My grandson, Liam, was humming to himself while pushing peas around his plate, and my daughter kept asking if everyone had enough to eat. On the surface, it looked like the kind of warm family evening people post about online with captions about gratitude. But something in my chest had felt unsettled since the moment I walked through that door. After 70 years of living, you learn to listen to that feeling. Your body notices things before your mind is ready to admit them. I had brought dessert, like always, apple pie. Homemade, the way my husband used to like it before he passed 5 years ago. My daughter hugged me when I arrived, but it was one of those quick hugs, the kind where someone's mind is somewhere else. My son-in-law barely looked up from his phone when he greeted me, and Liam, my sweet 8-year-old grandson, ran to me and squeezed my waist like I was the best thing that had happened all day. Children, I've noticed, are the only honest people left in most families. Dinner started normally enough. Plates clinked, chairs scraped the floor, and someone had the television playing softly in the living room, even though nobody was watching it. I asked Liam about school, and he told me a long story about a boy who brought a frog into class and how the teacher screamed louder than the students. We laughed about that. For a moment, I relaxed, thinking maybe that strange feeling inside me was just loneliness creeping in again. Then I noticed the looks. Little ones, quick ones. My daughter glancing at her husband, him shaking his head slightly, their voices lowering whenever I spoke. I've raised children. You don't spend decades doing that without learning the language of silence. Something was being kept from me. I just didn't know what. Halfway through dinner, Liam slid off his chair and disappeared for a moment under the table. I figured he'd dropped a fork or something. Kids are always dropping things. When he popped back up, he looked at me in a strange way. Not scared exactly, more like worried. That's when he tugged on my sleeve. "Grandma," he whispered. I leaned closer so my daughter wouldn't scold him for interrupting dinner. "What is it, sweetheart?" His small fingers pointed down. "Look under the table." I chuckled at first. "Why?" He didn't laugh back. "Just look." Something in his voice made my stomach tighten. At my age, you learn there are moments when the world quietly shifts before anything even happens, like the air itself is holding its breath. So I leaned down, and that was the moment my peaceful little family dinner cracked open. But before I tell you what I saw under that table, you need to understand something about my family, because nothing that happened that night came out of nowhere. Secrets don't appear suddenly. They grow slowly, like mold in the corners of a house nobody checks anymore. After my husband died, everything changed in ways I didn't expect. Grief doesn't just take a person away, it rearranges the entire family. My daughter, Sarah, started visiting less. She said she was busy with work and Liam's school activities, and I tried to understand. People have their own lives, but sometimes weeks passed without a phone call. I never complained. Mothers from my generation weren't built that way. We learned to keep things inside, smooth over tension, and tell ourselves that love was still there even when it went quiet. About a year after the funeral, Sarah started talking about finances more often. Not in a cruel way, just carefully. She asked if I was managing the house all right, if the bills were getting overwhelming, if I had considered downsizing. The house she was talking about wasn't just a building, it was the house her father built. Every nail, every creaky step, every mark on the kitchen wall where we measured her height growing up. That place held my entire life. I told her I was fine, and I was, mostly. But something in her voice during those conversations always sounded rehearsed, like she had practiced them beforehand. Eventually, the visits became even less frequent, except for Sunday dinners like this one. Those dinners became our tradition. My daughter insisted on them, said it was important for Liam to grow up close to his grandmother. I believed her. I wanted to believe her. Still, every now and then I caught small things that didn't add up. Conversations stopped. I forced myself to breathe slowly and keep my face calm, because when you reach my age, you learn that the most powerful thing you can do in a tense room is act like you don't see the tension at all. My daughter kept watching me the way someone watches a glass sitting too close to the edge of a table, like she expected it to fall at any second. My son-in-law suddenly became very interested in cutting his chicken, even though he had already finished half his plate. And little Liam, bless that boy, looked between all of us like he had just opened a door he didn't realize was locked for a reason. I reached over and patted his hand gently so he wouldn't feel scared. But inside my chest, something heavy had started to sink. The kind of feeling you get when you know the truth is sitting right in front of you, but no one is willing to say it out loud. "Everything all right, Mom?" Sarah asked again, and this time her voice sounded a little thinner. "Oh, yes," I said, picking up my fork. "Dinner is wonderful." I could feel the envelope under the table without even looking at it now. My mind was circling around it like a storm cloud. Why hide something with my name on it under the table? Why not simply give it to me? The answer that kept trying to form in my mind was one I didn't want to accept yet, because if I accepted it too quickly, the entire evening would collapse right there. So I did what mothers often do. I kept the peace for a few minutes longer. Liam leaned toward me again and whispered, "Did you see it?" I nodded slowly. His eyebrows squeezed together. "They said not to tell." Across the table, Sarah stiffened slightly. I realized she had heard him. "Liam," she said carefully, "eat your food." The room had grown strangely quiet. Even the television from the other room seemed far away now. I set my fork down and wiped my hands on my napkin again, buying myself a few seconds to think. If I reached down and pulled that envelope out, whatever was inside it would force the truth into the open, and once that happened, there would be no putting the evening back together again. Still, secrets have a way of rotting things from the inside. I looked at my daughter. I remembered the little girl who used to sit at my kitchen counter swinging her legs while I packed her school lunch. I remembered braiding her hair, helping her with homework, sitting up with her when she had fevers. For a brief moment, I wondered if I had somehow imagined the strange distance between us these past few years. Then I remembered the paperwork I once saw in her husband's hands with my home address printed across it. And suddenly, I knew I couldn't ignore the envelope. Slowly, without saying a word, I leaned down again and reached under the tablecloth. The reaction above the table was immediate. "Mom," Sarah started, but by then my fingers had already touched the thick paper. It was taped firmly underneath the table with long strips of clear tape, like someone wanted to make sure it wouldn't fall or be discovered too soon. I peeled it away carefully. The sound of the tape separating from the wood was louder than it should have been, like ripping cloth in a quiet church. When I sat back up, the envelope was in my hands. No one spoke. The front was plain except for my name written in my son-in-law's handwriting. My heart began beating faster. "Why was this under the table?" I asked softly. My daughter opened her mouth, then closed it again. Her husband spoke first. "It's nothing serious." Nothing serious. People only say that when something is very serious. I ran my thumb along the sealed edge of the envelope, but didn't open it yet. Instead, I looked at Liam. "Sweetheart, why did you show this to Grandma?" He shrugged a little bit. "Because you're supposed to get it." The honesty of children is sometimes the sharpest knife in the room. Sarah rubbed her forehead. "Liam, honey, we talked about this." "I didn't lie," he said quietly. "No," I murmured, touching his shoulder. "Then you didn't." Then I turned back to the envelope. "You were going to give this to me tonight?" I asked. Another silence. My son-in-law shifted in his chair. "Yes, after dinner." "Then why hide it under the table?" Neither of them answered immediately, and that silence told me more than words could have, because suddenly I understood something. They hadn't hidden the envelope from me. They'd hidden it from Liam, which meant whatever was inside it wasn't meant to look suspicious until the right moment. My chest tightened. "Mom," Sarah said slowly, "just open it." I studied her face. She looked nervous, but also determined, like someone who had already decided the outcome of a conversation before it even started. I slipped my finger under the flap and opened the envelope. Inside was a stack of papers, official papers. The moment I saw the formatting, my stomach dropped. I had seen documents like these before, property documents. My hand suddenly felt weaker. I pulled the first page out and read the title. For a few seconds, my brain refused to process the words. Then they landed. Transfer of ownership. My house address was printed right below it. The room seemed to tilt slightly. I looked up slowly at my daughter. "What is this?" I asked. Her husband cleared his throat like he had prepared a speech. "It's just paperwork to help simplify things in the future." Simplify things. That phrase echoed in my mind. My husband used to say when someone uses soft words for hard actions, you should listen carefully to what they're really saying. "You want my house," I said quietly. Sarah leaned forward quickly. "No, Mom, that's not what this is." I lifted the paper slightly. "Then explain why these say ownership transfer." The tension in the room snapped tight like a rope pulled too far. My son-in-law spoke again, a little firmer now. "It's just planning ahead. Taxes, legal complications, things like that." Planning ahead for what? That question sat heavy between us. And suddenly, for the first time that evening, a frightening thought crossed my mind. What if this dinner was never about family at all? What if I had been invited here for one reason only, to sign something? I looked down at the documents again, and that's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold, because halfway down the page, there was already a signature line waiting for me. For a long moment, I simply stared at that signature line, my eyes tracing the blank space where my name was supposed to go, as if the paper itself were quietly expecting my cooperation. The strange thing about betrayal is that when it first appears, your mind tries to soften it, to find some gentle explanation that doesn't hurt as much as the truth. Part of me wanted to believe this was just a misunderstanding, some poorly explained financial idea my daughter thought would help me. But another part of me, the part that had lived long enough to recognize rehearsed conversations and careful silences, already knew this was something else. I set the papers down slowly on the table and folded my hands in front of me so no one could see them trembling. Across from me, Sarah was watching my face like someone waiting for a storm to either pass or break. "You should read the rest," my son-in-law said. His voice sounded patient, but there was a tightness underneath it. I nodded slightly and glanced back at the document. The words were polite and professional, the kind of legal language that makes serious things sound harmless. It talked about transferring ownership of my home to my daughter and her husband, while allowing me to continue living there for the foreseeable future. It mentioned simplifying inheritance, avoiding probate, protecting family assets. All very neat, all very convincing. But something about the timing of it made my stomach twist. because no one had spoken to me beforehand. Not once. "Sarah," I said quietly, "how long have you been planning this?" She shifted in her chair. "It's not like that." That wasn't the question. Her husband leaned back slightly, folding his arms. "We've been thinking about it for a while. It's just smart planning." Smart for who, I wondered. Liam looked confused now, glancing between us like he was watching a game where he didn't know the rules anymore. I forced a small smile at him so he wouldn't feel frightened, but the warmth in the room had completely disappeared. "You hid this under the table," I said calmly. "Why?" No one answered right away. Finally, Sarah sighed. "Because we didn't want you to get upset before we explained everything." That answer landed in my chest like a small stone. So they knew I wouldn't like it, which meant this wasn't something they expected me to happily agree to. I looked down at the house address printed on the page again. The house my husband built with his own hands, the garden he planted, the porch where we used to sit on summer nights listening to crickets. Every memory of my adult life lived inside those walls. And now, those memories were sitting inside a stack of papers on my daughter's dinner table. "You could have talked to me," I said softly. "We're talking now," her husband replied. The calmness in his voice bothered me more than anger would have, because calm people in situations like this usually believe they're right. Sarah leaned forward again. "Mom, we're just trying to help you. That house is too much responsibility for you now." There it was. Not cruel exactly, but dismissive. "I've managed it fine so far." "Yes, but things change," she replied quickly. "What if something happens? What if you get sick? This way, everything is already taken care of." Something in the way she said it made my chest tighten again. What if something happens? Those words didn't feel like concern. They felt like expectation. I glanced at Liam again. He was quietly pushing his peas into a small pile, listening even though he pretended not to. "You shouldn't be having this conversation in front of him," I said gently. Sarah exhaled. "He doesn't understand." Children understand more than adults think, but I didn't say that out loud. Instead, I lifted the papers again and flipped through them slowly. There were several pages, all carefully prepared. Whoever had arranged this had done their homework, which raised another question in my mind. "Who helped you with this?" I asked. Her husband answered immediately. "A lawyer." "Of course." I nodded slowly. "So this wasn't just an idea. This was already arranged." Silence again. That silence confirmed everything. I placed the papers back inside the envelope carefully, smoothing the edge like I needed a few extra seconds to steady my thoughts. The room felt different now, like the walls had moved a little closer together. "Mom," Sarah said gently, "we're not trying to take anything from you." But the strange thing about that sentence was that the papers in front of me said the opposite. I looked directly into her eyes. "Then why does this say you will own my house?" Her mouth opened slightly, but no words came out right away. Her husband spoke again. "Because eventually it will be ours anyway. This just avoids complications." Eventually. Such a simple word, but hearing it made something deep inside my chest ache in a way I didn't expect. Eventually meant they were already thinking about a time when I wasn't there anymore. I suddenly felt very old sitting at that table, not because of my age, but because the people across from me were already planning the world after me. Liam looked up at me suddenly. "Grandma, are you sad?" His voice cut through the tension like a bell. I reached over and squeezed his hand gently. "No, sweetheart, I'm just thinking." And I was. Thinking about every quiet conversation over the past 2 years, every strange glance, every mention of finances, all the small things I had told myself not to question. Now they were sitting here in front of me, finally making sense. But there was still one thing that didn't. If they believed this was so reasonable, why hide the envelope? Why not simply hand it to me like an honest request? That question lingered in my mind as I studied both of their faces again. And slowly, another possibility began. The silence that followed my question stretched across the table like a shadow that refused to move. When people are caught between honesty and self-defense, their faces change in very small ways. I watched my daughter's shoulders tighten, watched her husband glance briefly at the papers before looking back at me. Neither of them answered right away, and that pause told me more than words could have. I had raised Sarah myself. I knew exactly what she looked like when she was trying to figure out which version of the truth to say. Finally, she exhaled slowly and pushed a strand of hair behind her ear, the same nervous habit she had when she was 16 and trying to explain why she had missed curfew. "We were hoping you'd consider it tonight," she said carefully. Consider it. Such a gentle word for something that had clearly been prepared long before I arrived. I nodded once, letting that answer settle in my chest. The strange thing was, I didn't feel angry yet, not the loud kind of anger people expect. What I felt instead was a quiet heaviness, like discovering a crack in the foundation of a house you thought was solid. "And if I didn't?" I asked. Her husband spoke before she could. "Why wouldn't you?" It was such a simple question, but the tone inside it carried something else. Expectation, confidence, as if the answer should be obvious. I folded my hands again and studied him for a moment. Over the years, I had tried very hard to like him, and in many ways I did. He provided for his family, he rarely raised his voice, and he always spoke politely in public. But there had always been something about the way he approached decisions, like life was a business arrangement and every conversation was a negotiation waiting to happen. "Because it's my home," I said gently. "That wouldn't change," Sarah replied quickly. "You would still live there." "For now," I said. That was the phrase written in the document, "for the foreseeable future," a sentence that sounded comforting until you thought about who decided when the future changed. Liam looked up again, sensing the tension even though he didn't understand the details. "Are we in trouble?" "No, sweetheart," I said softly, reaching across the table to squeeze his shoulder. "No one is in trouble." But inside, I could feel the room shifting again, the conversation moving towards something none of us had fully prepared for. Sarah leaned forward slightly, her voice more urgent now. "Mom, please don't make this bigger than it is. We're just trying to plan ahead. Lots of families do this." "Families also talk to each other first," I replied. That landed harder than I expected. Sarah's expression flickered for a moment, hurt mixing with frustration. For a second, I wondered if maybe she truly believed what she was saying, if maybe somewhere along the way she had convinced herself this was kindness instead of pressure. Her husband sighed quietly and rubbed his hands together on the table. "Look, we didn't want to worry you before we had everything prepared, that's all." "Prepared for what exactly?" I asked. He gestured lightly toward the envelope. "For the future." There was that word again, future. A future that apparently included decisions about my life made without me. I glanced around the dining room slowly. I had been sitting in the same chair every Sunday for nearly a year, laughing with Liam, bringing desserts, listening to stories about school and work. I had believed those dinners were about staying connected as a family. But now a thought crept into my mind that made my stomach tighten in a way I couldn't quite explain. What if those dinners had slowly become something else? What if tonight had always been the destination? "Sarah," I said quietly, "when were you planning to bring this up?" She hesitated just long enough to confirm my suspicion. "Tonight," she said. "After dessert?" I asked. Her silence answered that too. I nodded slowly, absorbing that information piece by piece. Something about the image of that envelope taped under the table kept returning to me. The secrecy of it, the planning behind it. It was such an odd place to hide something unless you didn't want anyone noticing it too early, or unless you were worried someone might stop you. My eyes drifted toward Liam again. Why was it under the table? I asked. Sarah looked tired suddenly. Because we didn't want to worry Liam before we were ready. Liam frowned. I always sit here. The room went still again. That small sentence landed with surprising weight, because suddenly I realized something none of us had thought about carefully enough. They had hidden the envelope under the table in the exact place their curious 8-year-old grandson liked to play with his toy cars during dinner, which meant the secret was never as secure as they believed. I felt a strange mix of sadness and irony settle inside me. The only reason I knew about the papers before their carefully planned moment was because a child noticed something adults overlooked. Sometimes the truth finds its own way out. Sarah pressed her fingers to her temple like she was fighting a headache. This is getting out of hand. No, I said softly, it's finally getting honest. Her husband leaned forward now, his patience thinning. We're not your enemies here. I didn't say you were, but you're acting like we're trying to rob you. The word rob hung in the air. I hadn't said it, but hearing it spoken aloud made something in my chest shift, because sometimes the person defending themselves reveals more than they intend. I'm acting like someone who was invited to dinner and handed legal documents, I replied calmly. That's dramatic, he said. No, I said quietly, it's accurate. Sarah looked between us, clearly wishing the conversation would slow down again. Mom, please, we're family. Yes, I said, that's why this matters. For a moment, no one spoke. Even Liam had stopped moving his food around, sensing that something important was happening, even if he didn't understand it. I took a slow breath and looked back at the envelope resting on the table. Did you expect me to sign it right away? She hesitated. Her husband did not. We thought you'd trust us. The more I sat there quietly, the more uncomfortable the room seemed to become. It was almost as if my calmness had removed the script they expected the evening to follow. I had this strange feeling that perhaps they had imagined something very different when they planned this dinner. Maybe they expected tears, confusion, or a quick emotional agreement. Maybe they thought presenting the papers suddenly would overwhelm me enough that I would sign just to keep the peace. But life teaches you patience, especially after 70 years of it. And patience can be a very unsettling thing for people who are waiting for a reaction. I folded my hands and rested them on the table. Tell me something, honestly, I said. Sarah looked wary. What? Whose idea was this? Her eyes moved briefly toward her husband before returning to me. That small glance was enough to answer half the question already. We both agreed, she said. That wasn't what I asked. Her husband shifted in his chair. It doesn't matter who suggested it. We're trying to help. Help. That word had been used several times now, but the more it appeared, the less it sounded like help. Did the lawyer tell you to do it this way? I asked. No, he said quickly. So that part had been their idea. I nodded slowly, absorbing that. My gaze drifted toward Liam again. He was leaning his chin on his hand now, watching all of us with quiet curiosity. You know, I said gently, when your grandfather built that house, he did most of the work himself. Sarah sighed faintly. Mom, this isn't about memories. But it is, I said. Houses are always about memories. Her husband gave a polite smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Memories don't pay property taxes. That sentence sat in the air for a moment. Not cruel, but cold. I studied him carefully then. It suddenly struck me that he had spoken more than Sarah throughout this entire conversation. That detail had slipped past me earlier because everything had happened so quickly, but now that I noticed it, I couldn't stop noticing it. And another memory surfaced quietly in my mind. 2 years ago, shortly after my husband passed, he had asked me a question during a family barbecue. Have you ever thought about what you'll do with the house long term? At the time, it sounded like casual conversation. Now it sounded like the beginning of something. Can I ask another question? I said calmly. Neither of them answered, but their expressions told me to go ahead. How long have these papers been ready? Sarah hesitated again. Her husband spoke. About 3 weeks. 3 weeks. So tonight had been arranged, planned, prepared. I glanced down at the envelope once more. The neatness of it all suddenly felt very deliberate. Did you ever plan to tell me beforehand? I asked. Sarah's voice softened with, "We didn't want you worrying." That explanation didn't sit right with me, not because it was impossible, but because it was incomplete. You didn't want me to think about it, I said quietly. Her husband leaned forward slightly. We didn't want you to talk yourself out of something that makes sense. There it was, the honesty that had been hiding behind careful language all evening. He believed this decision was already correct. My role was simply to accept it. I felt a slow breath leave my chest. You've both spent a lot of time thinking about my future. Did either of you think about asking what I want? Sarah looked genuinely frustrated now. Mom, we know what you want. You want to stay in the house. This lets you do that. For now, I said again. That phrase had become the quiet weight hanging over the entire table. Liam raised his hand suddenly like he was in school. I like Grandma's house. Despite everything, a small smile tugged at the corner of my mouth. I'm glad someone does, I said gently. Sarah rubbed her forehead again. Liam, honey, please go watch television for a few minutes. I'm not done eating. Her patience was thinning now, and I could see the tension building behind her eyes. Something about that made me strangely sad, because I realized she probably thought this conversation would be simple, quick, resolved by now. Instead, it was stretching longer and longer, which meant whatever outcome they expected was slowly drifting out of reach. My son-in-law tapped the table lightly with his finger. Look, we're going in circles. Are we? I asked. Yes, he said. This is a practical decision. Practical for you. That sentence landed harder than anything else I had said so far. The room went very still. Sarah looked me carefully. What is that supposed to mean? I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse anyone. I simply asked another question. If the house was already yours, what would change? Neither of them answered immediately, but the hesitation was enough, because in that moment I saw something I hadn't allowed myself to fully consider until now. Security, control, ownership, things that matter very differently depending on which side of the paperwork you're sitting on. I think, I said slowly, you believe you're protecting something. We are, her husband replied. What? He didn't hesitate this time. The future. I held his gaze for a long moment. I didn't say that thought out loud right away, because sometimes the most revealing thing you can do is let silence sit in a room and watch who becomes uncomfortable first. Liam was still looking at me with those wide, observant eyes children have when they sense something important is unfolding, while Sarah and her husband seemed to be studying my face like they were trying to predict my next sentence before it arrived. The envelope sat between us now, like an unexpected guest at the table. For a moment, I simply rested my hands in my lap and leaned back slightly, letting the quiet stretch long enough that even the ticking clock on the kitchen wall became noticeable. It's strange how loud ordinary sounds become when a family is trying not to argue. Finally, I looked gently at my grandson. "Liam," I said softly, "can I ask you something?" Sarah shifted immediately. "Mom, he doesn't need to be part of this." I kept my voice calm. "I'm not putting him in the middle. I'm just asking a question." Liam straightened a little, like he had been invited to participate in something serious. "Okay," I smiled faintly. "When you showed me the envelope earlier, did you find it tonight?" He shook his head. "No." Across the table, Sarah's shoulders stiffened. Her husband's eyes narrowed just slightly. "When did you find it?" I asked gently. Liam thought for a second. "Yesterday." That answer changed the air in the room immediately. Sarah sat up. "Yesterday?" He nodded. "I was playing under the table with my car and I saw tape." He held his hands out like he was describing something exciting rather than complicated. "I thought it was treasure." Children always think hidden things are treasure. I couldn't help smiling a little at that, even though the situation was anything but simple. "Did you open it?" I asked. "No, Mom said not to touch it." Sarah let out a slow breath that sounded halfway between relief and frustration. Her husband rubbed his jaw quietly. But something about Liam's answer had already begun rearranging pieces in my mind, because if the envelope had been there since yesterday, then this dinner hadn't just been planned, it had been staged, prepared carefully in advance like a performance waiting for its moment. I turned my eyes back toward Sarah. "You taped it there yesterday?" She hesitated. "Yes." "Why?" My tone wasn't angry. That seemed to confuse her more than anything. "Because we didn't want to misplace it," she said. Her husband added quickly, "and we didn't want Liam messing with it." Liam frowned slightly. "But I found it." No one answered him. I steadied both of them quietly, letting the details settle. When people tell half-truths, the gaps between their explanations start to show if you're patient enough. "So the plan," I said slowly, "was dinner first, then the envelope?" Sarah pressed her lips together. "We just wanted a normal evening before talking about it." "Normal," I repeated softly. The words sounded almost fragile now, because the truth was, this evening had never been normal at all. It had been carefully arranged from the beginning, the food, the conversation, the timing, and suddenly another realization slipped into place beside the others. "Did you expect me to be surprised?" I asked. Her husband answered without hesitation. "Yes." "Why?" He blinked slightly, as if the answer should be obvious. "Because sometimes that makes things easier." That sentence hung in the air like a quiet confession. I tilted my head slightly. "Easier for who?" He didn't answer immediately. Sarah spoke instead. "Mom, please stop turning this into something ugly." I looked at her with a calm that surprised even me. "I'm not the one who taped legal documents under a dinner table." That was the first sentence that truly landed like a stone in water. Sarah's face flushed slightly. Her husband leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms again, the patience in his posture thinning. Liam looked between us like he was watching adults fail a test he didn't understand. I reached over and gently moved his glass of water away from the edge of the table before it could spill. The small, normal gesture seemed to soften something in the room for a second. "You know," I said quietly, "when people start planning your future without you, it feels very strange." Sarah's voice cracked a little. "We weren't trying to hurt you." "I believe that," I said, and I did believe that, at least partly. That was the complicated part of the whole situation. They didn't see themselves as villains in this story. They saw themselves as responsible adults trying to organize life before it became messy. But somewhere in that process, they had forgotten something important. I leaned forward slightly and rested my hands on the table again. "You skipped a step." Sarah frowned. "What step?" "Talking to me." Silence settled again. Outside, a car passed slowly down the street, its headlights briefly washing across the window behind them. My son-in-law tapped the table once more, a small, impatient rhythm. "We are talking now." "No," I said gently. "Now we're reacting." That distinction seemed to land deeper than the others, because conversations that begin after a decision has already been made rarely feel fair to the person hearing them. Liam suddenly spoke again, his voice small but clear. "Grandma's house has the swing." The adults paused. He continued, "And the tree with the crooked branch." I felt my throat tighten unexpectedly. Children remember homes in pieces like that, not paperwork, not ownership, just swings and branches and rooms they felt safe. I smiled softly at him. "Yes, it does." Sarah looked exhausted now, like the evening had become much heavier than she expected. "Mom, what do you want us to do?" That question finally arrived, and it was the first one that sounded real, not strategic, not rehearsed, just tired and human. I took a slow breath and glanced at the envelope one more time before answering. "I want time," I said. Her husband frowned immediately. "Time for what?" I met his gaze steadily. "Time to think about why my daughter felt the need to hide my future under a dinner table." No one spoke after that, because sometimes the quiet truth of a sentence settles deeper than an argument ever could. And sitting there in that silence, watching their expressions slowly change, I realized something important about the evening that hadn't been clear. The quiet that followed my request for time felt different from the earlier silences that evening. Before, the pauses had been tense, like everyone was waiting for someone else to say the right thing. Now the quiet felt heavier, more honest. No one at the table seemed entirely sure what the next step was supposed to be anymore. Even my son-in-law, who had spoken with such certainty earlier, looked like someone whose careful plan had quietly slipped off its rails. Sarah leaned back slowly in her chair and let out a breath she had probably been holding since I pulled the envelope from under the table. For a moment, she looked less like a determined adult trying to solve a financial problem and more like the girl who used to come to me when something went wrong at school. "I didn't want it to feel like this," she said. Her voice was softer now, stripped of the firm edge it had earlier. "Like what?" I asked gently. "Like we're against you." I watched her carefully as she said it, searching her face for the line between sincerity and guilt. The truth is, families rarely see themselves clearly in moments like these. Everyone believes they're the reasonable one. "I don't think you're against me," I said calmly. Her husband shifted in his seat. "It sounds like you do." "No," I replied, still keeping my voice even. "I think you were trying to solve a problem without realizing you created another one." That seemed to land in the middle of the table, where none of us could ignore it. Liam had started quietly eating again, sensing the storm had softened but not disappeared. I watched him for a second and felt a strange wave of gratitude toward that little boy. If he hadn't been curious enough to look under the table yesterday, tonight might have unfolded very differently. I might have been handed those papers at the end of dessert. I might have felt cornered, and people who feel cornered often make decisions just to escape the moment. My son-in-law rubbed his forehead slowly. "You're acting like we set a trap." I didn't respond immediately, because in truth, that was exactly how it had felt when I first saw the envelope taped underneath the table. But instead of accusing him, I asked a quieter question. "What would you have done if I refused?" Sarah blinked slightly. Her husband hesitated. That hesitation told me enough. "We would have talked about it," he said finally. "Tonight?" I asked. "Yes." "And if I still said no?" Neither of them answered right away. The silence stretched just long enough for the answer to become obvious. Eventually, he shrugged lightly. "We would have tried again another time." There it was, persistence, not conversation. I nodded slowly. "I appreciate your honesty." Sarah looked frustrated again. Why does this feel like a courtroom? It doesn't. It feels like a family finally saying what they've been avoiding. That sentence seemed to deflate some of the tension in her shoulders. She looked down at the table for a moment, tracing a small circle on the wood the way she used to when she was thinking hard about something. I was worried about you, she said quietly. I tilted my head slightly. In what way? You're alone in that house. The statement was simple, but the emotion behind it sounded real. For the first time that evening, I didn't hear strategy in her voice. I heard fear. Being alone isn't the same as being helpless, I said gently. I know that, she replied quickly, but things happen. People fall, people get sick. I didn't want everything to become complicated later. Her husband nodded slightly beside her, relieved perhaps that the conversation had moved into territory that sounded more reasonable. And the truth is, part of what she was saying wasn't wrong. Life does become complicated. Paperwork matters, preparation matters, but the way it happens matters too. Do you remember when you were 10 and you tried to cut your own hair? Sarah blinked in confusion. What? You were afraid to ask me because you thought I'd say no, so you did it secretly in the bathroom. For the first time all evening, a small, reluctant smile appeared on her face. That was different. Was it? I asked gently. Her husband looked between us like he wasn't sure where the story was going. You cut your hair without asking because you assumed my answer, and then you had to come to me afterward to fix it. Sarah sighed quietly as the comparison settled. That's not fair. No, I agreed gently, but it's similar. Because the real issue wasn't the house, it was the assumption, the belief that my answer needed to be managed instead of heard. The kitchen had grown calm now, the earlier tension replaced by something slower and more thoughtful. Even my son-in-law seemed less defensive, though he still watched me carefully, like someone studying a puzzle. Finally, he spoke again. So what happens now? That question sat in the center of the table, simple but heavy. I looked at the envelope, then at my daughter, then at Liam. You take those papers home tonight. Neither of them interrupted, so I continued. You give me time to think about them properly, not at a dinner table, not with everyone watching. Sarah nodded slowly. That's fair. Her husband hesitated, but eventually nodded as well. But before the moment could settle completely, Liam suddenly said something that made all three of us pause. Grandma, are you mad? Children ask the most direct questions in the quietest voices. I turned toward him and smiled gently. No, sweetheart. Really? Yes, I said softly, but I am paying attention. He seemed satisfied with that answer, though I'm not entirely sure the adults at the table were, because paying attention can be more powerful than anger. And as I sat there looking at my family, another thought had already begun forming in the back of my mind. A thought about the house, about the future, about the difference between protecting something and controlling it. The truth is, they weren't the only ones capable of planning ahead, and for the first time this dinner began, I realized I had a decision to make that none of them were expecting, a decision that would reveal whether this evening was really about property or about trust. But that choice didn't belong at this table, not yet. That night after dinner, I drove home slowly. The streets were quiet, the kind of quiet that lets your thoughts speak a little louder than usual. The envelope wasn't with me anymore. Sarah had taken it back like I asked, but the weight of it still felt like it was sitting in the passenger seat beside me the entire drive home. Sometimes decisions don't need to be made immediately. Sometimes the most important thing is giving yourself enough distance from other people's expectations so you can actually hear your own thoughts. When I pulled into my driveway, the porch light flickered the way it always does before fully turning on. My husband never got around to fixing that. For years, I used to remind him, and he would always say, tomorrow. Funny how tomorrow turns into memories faster than you expect. I sat in the car for a minute, just looking at the house. The same house printed across those papers earlier that evening. The same house my daughter and her husband were trying to plan the future of. It didn't look like a financial asset. It looked like a life. I went inside, hung my coat on the same hook it had hung on for decades, and walked through the room slowly. The living room still smelled faintly like the lemon polish I used that morning. My husband's old chair sat near the window, exactly where he left it. I ran my hand across the back of it and felt the familiar fabric under my fingers. People think houses are about ownership, but houses are really about time. Every hallway in that place held years of it. I made a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table, the quiet settling around me like an old friend. No tension, no expectations, just space to think. Sarah's words replayed in my mind, her worry about the future, her fear of things becoming complicated, and underneath that, the part that hurt the most, the assumption that my voice didn't need to come first. I didn't sleep much that night, not because I was angry, but because I was thinking about something bigger than paperwork. I was thinking about trust. The next morning, I made a phone call, not to Sarah, not to her husband. I called someone else, and that conversation lasted almost an hour. By the time it ended, something inside me felt steady again. Not emotional, not reactive, just clear. 2 days later, I invited Sarah and her family over for dinner at my house. When she arrived, she looked nervous, the same way I had felt walking into her dining room earlier that week. Liam ran straight past her into the living room the moment he saw the old wooden train set I keep for him. Children always know where the warmth in a house is. We sat at the same kitchen table where Sarah used to do her homework years ago. I served dinner first, no envelopes, no surprises, just food and conversation. I could tell she was waiting for the moment the real discussion would begin, but I didn't rush it. Sometimes people need to sit in normal moments for a while before they're ready for important ones. Finally, after the dishes were cleared and Liam wandered into the living room, Sarah looked at me carefully. "Have you thought about it?" she asked. "Yes," I said. Her husband leaned forward slightly. "And?" I stood up, walked to the counter, and brought back a folder. Not the envelope from before, a different one. I placed it gently on the table. Sarah looked confused. "What's that?" "My plan," I said calmly. Her husband frowned slightly as Sarah opened the folder. Inside were several documents, neatly organized. I watched their faces as they read the first page. Confusion first, then surprise, then something deeper. Because the papers weren't transferring the house to them. Instead, the documents explained that the house had been placed into a small family trust, one that allowed me to live there for the rest of my life without question, one that protected the home from being sold or transferred under pressure, and one that guaranteed something very specific for the future. Sarah looked up slowly. "You made a trust?" "Yes," I said. Her husband flipped through the pages again. "When?" "The morning after dinner." The room was very quiet now. Sarah's voice softened. "Who helped you with this?" "A lawyer," I said. The same word he had used earlier that week, but this time it carried a different meaning. Her husband leaned back slowly, processing what he was seeing. "So what does this mean exactly?" "It means the house is protected," I said calmly. Sarah read further down the page and her eyes widened slightly, because the final section explained something important. When the time eventually comes that I'm gone, the house won't belong to just one person. It will belong to Liam, held safely until he's grown. The room stayed silent for several seconds after that. Not tense this time, just thoughtful. Finally, Sarah looked at me, her eyes softer than they had been all week. "You were planning too." "Yes," I said gently. Her husband closed the folder slowly. For the first time since this entire situation started, he didn't look defensive or confident. He looked reflective. "That's actually very smart," he admitted quietly. I smiled slightly. "Planning ahead," I said. Sarah let out a small laugh, the tension breaking in her shoulders. "I guess we deserved that." "No," I replied kindly. You deserved to be part of the conversation." She looked down at the papers again. "I'm sorry," she said.